So I want to read 3 pages from an essay by Owen Barfield in this book, The Rediscovery of Meaning and Other Essays. I think Barfield's an extremely important thinker, particularly for our age, because of the tendencies of thought which we have fallen into, the things we take for granted, and think as common sense about the nature of ourselves, the nature of reality, of nature, and the nature of the relation between ourselves and nature or reality. So I'm going to read, starting on page 171. Again, the essay is called Matter, Imagination, and Spirit. He's talking about the relations between these three things. Mere perception without imagination, is the sword thrust between spirit and matter. It was the increasing predominance of this kind of perception within Western humanity that enabled the philosopher Descartes to formulate his partition of all being into the two mutually exclusive categories of extended and thinking substances, which is another way of saying between matter and spirit. But mere perception is not what normally occurs when we look at or listen to a fellow being. When we do that, we see his body or hear his voice, not only as matter, but also as expression. We see his body and his countenance as a material picture of the immaterial. I say that is what normally occurs, and I think it does normally occur to some extent every time one human being observes another. But of course, it may occur to a greater or lesser degree. And the extent to which it does occur will depend a good deal on ourselves. We may, or we may not, make up our minds that it shall occur, in our case, to the maximum degree of which our imagination is capable. 'Tis not in mortals to command success, and the result will be uncertain. What seems certain is that something very important will depend on the extent to which we are successful. For what will depend on it is precisely what I suggested just now is the most important thing in a meeting between two human beings. That it should be not simply a relation between two phenomena, but a relation between two spirits. Now, it is possible to look not only at a fellow being, but also at the world of nature in that way. That is to say, not merely as matter, but also as expression. It is possible, but for most people, it is no longer normal and instinctive to do so. It has been becoming less and less normal in the course of the last 300 or 400 years. And the great discovery made by the poets and philosophers of the Romantic movement was just this, that although it is no longer normal, it is not impossible. This is the discovery that found expression and became embodied in the aesthetic and philosophical concept of imagination, as it was developed especially in England and in Germany in the second half of the 18th and the first half of the 19th century. That it is to imagination, in the first place, that we must look for the healing of that Cartesian sword thrust between matter and spirit. Thus, for all these reasons, I have long felt that whether by way of the so-called inanimate world of nature, or whether by way of our fellow beings, a strengthening and deepening of the faculty of imagination, or better say the activity of imagination, is the only way in which we can really begin to have to do with spirit. I think I would put it this way. We live in that abrupt gap between matter and spirit. We exist by virtue of it as autonomous, self-conscious, individual spirits, as free beings. Often, in addition, it makes us feel lamentably isolated. But because our freedom and responsibility depend on it, any way that involves disregarding the gap or pretending it is not there is a way we take at our peril. Now, imagination does not disregard the gap. It depends on it. It lives in it, as our very self-consciousness does, in this case, not as a small, helpless creature caught in a trap between the two, but rather as a rainbow spanning the two precipices and linking them harmoniously together. The concern of imagination is neither with mere matter nor with pure spirit. It is thus a psychic or psychosomatic activity. On the other hand, if we are seeking to have to do with spirit, it is worse than useless to try to approach it by way of scientific investigation, at least as the word science is used today, for science is avowedly based on mere perception, and in mere perception it will always be matter we are having to do with, and never spirit. And whatever else one can do with a gap, one cannot use it as a means of crossing itself. Spirit, as I have said, is not what we can perceive, but what we are, and experience of spirit must depend not on what we see, but on the manner in which we look. It seems better, therefore, to take the other course, so far from attempting to disregard the gap, or, if you prefer, the wound between matter and spirit, to realize very fully that, as human beings on earth, we can only live in it. We can only live there today, however it may have been in the past, when the word spirit, or spiritus, or pneuma, or ruach had a different meaning. It seems better to realize the gap and live in it not as a creature caught in a trap, but as the rainbow that spans it. Then, within the rainbow or spectrum of imagination, we shall find ourselves free to move, sometimes in one direction, sometimes the other, either towards the one extremity, let us say the red one of matter and perception, or towards the violet extremity of pure spirit. We shall be free to turn either outward towards what we perceive or inward towards what we are. I have mentioned the romantic movement. It will be in the former direction that we shall turn, as Goethe did, when our primary concern is to have to do with spirit through nature, and, by perceiving nature as expression, to realize for ourselves that matter is, after all, spirit. It will be in the latter direction that we shall turn, as Hegel did, when our primary concern is to have to do with the human spirit. And note that what I said about being able to turn in either direction is well illustrated by these two examples. Goethe's primary concern, both as a poet and as a scientist, was with nature, but he was also a student of Spinoza and an intimate admirer of Hegel. Hegel's primary interest, on the other hand, lay within, but he was the author not only of the Phenomenology of Spirit, but also of a long work containing much scientific detail on the philosophy of nature. It must be said that both Goethe and Hegel had been given the freedom of the spectrum of imagination, and the same is true of Coleridge, whose mind could turn so easily in either direction. It is, of course, in the second direction, that of the human spirit, that we must turn if we are seeking to do with spirit in one special sense. This is the sense which many people feel to be the most important of all. I have a suspicion that they are right, though I would wish to emphasize that I mean important not merely for two human beings I shall be referring to in a moment, but for the whole future of humanity. The issue of survival after death today has, I believe, that kind of importance as well as the personal one. But I am not very fond of the word survival in this context. It has too strong a suggestion of a mere prolongation of the life we are so familiar with. I prefer immortality as suggesting a transition to a new and very different kind of life. Perhaps I may recall for a moment what I said earlier about the relation between two human beings, when I distinguished a relation between two phenomena from a relation between two spirits. The latter relation is achieved only when we experience another in the same mode as we experience ourselves, when we experience him not across the gap between spirit and matter, but as being on the same side of the gap as we are. It is of course possible to hold, and there are those who hold it, that when we perceive the body of another human being, we merely perceive matter, and we then go on to draw the inference that, Because his body is something like our body, there must be something like us within it. But I see no evidence that anyone has in fact ever syllogized in that way, and I believe it to be nonsense. What is true is that the extent to which we perceive his body as mere matter, and the extent to which we experience it as spirit, will depend on the degree of imagination with which we are perceiving. We may call this moral imagination, to distinguish it from the aesthetic imagination, which is concerned with the perception of nature. To the extent that we experience another's spiritual activity in speech, in gesture, in the mobility of his countenance, and so on, in the same mode as our own, and thus as if it were our own, we are exercising moral imagination. Now, it follows, I think, from all I have been saying, that if the word spirit means anything real, then spirit depends on matter or on body not for its being, but for its expression. Incarnation is the way in which spirit becomes evident through the senses to imagination. To the extent, then, that we shall have succeeded in traversing the spectrum of imagination in the direction of the human spirit, we shall have diminished the use we make of the body of the other for our relation with his spirit. It will have become less and less essential. Indeed, because we are not of imagination, all compact, and our perceptions of matter cannot all be transfigured by imagination, the phenomenal relation may well prove in some respects a positive hindrance to the spiritual one. But the point I want to make first is that we can experience another spirit as spirit, only in the same mode as we experience ourselves. This, I believe, is a truth that holds irrespective of life and death. But it is the death of the body of our friend that brings it home to us with special sharpness. For there is, after all, much else in the relation between two human beings, and much else that we value dearly and long to preserve, besides the relation between two spirits. What death does is to force us to concentrate on that most important relation of all, by taking all the others away from us. In particular, it takes away that part of our relation that was based on expression, at least as I have been using the term. For I have been using it to mean a function of incarnate spirit. And we may feel this to be the most important, the most desperately important of all, since expression is, between incarnate spirits, the normal means of communication between the one and the other. Does death, then, take away all possibility of every kind of communication between the one and the other? I think not. But we must remember what kind of communication it is we are speaking of. We are speaking now of the experience which one spirit may have of another spirit, directly as spirit, therefore of a very close and intimate experience indeed. Furthermore, I have sought to demonstrate that we can experience another spirit only in the same mode that we experience our own, that is, in the mode that we experience ourselves. It follows that the communications of the dead can only come to us from within, not by the long and bumpy road through matter, expression, and perception, but arising within us as events occurring within ourselves. This is, in fact, the only form in which I myself can recognize, or even, I think, desire communication with some of my friends who have died before me. It can be a very real, but also, no doubt because I am a very limited person, a very limited experience. Here, the problem is that it is a very subtle form of communication, and one that it is very difficult to discern. This follows, I would say, from the very fact that it takes place without the aid of expression, without the sturdy confidence we are given by the gap between matter and spirit, because it occurs wholly on the spirit side of the gap. We have thus to learn to distinguish between subject and object, not just in the field of commonplace experience, where object means matter and subject means ourselves. We have to distinguish between subjective spirit and objective spirit, or between spiritual experience that is merely subjective and that which is also objective, or between that which is merely ourselves and that which is another being in ourselves. And here let me hasten to add that I, for one, owe virtually the whole of such understanding of the problem and its possible solution as I possess to the writings of Rudolf Steiner. So, what do you make of that?